Well, Melissa, it has been a strange week here. It's really warm, which is abnormal for Scotland. And I'm feeling good. I'm feeling really good, actually. I
Good.
haven't drunk any alcohol for 10 days. I normally enjoy like a red
Wow.
wine with dinner and stuff like that. And it's really helped my sleep. I'm feeling like really quite refreshed and I've got some sun. So hopefully this will be a productive episode of Poker Distilled.
What is the normal weather in summer in Scotland?
It can be like terrible. So in terms of Celsius, I don't know Fahrenheit, and you probably don't know Celsius. Maybe you do, but we're probably speaking different languages here. But you get
Yeah.
like right now, it is, what does it say? Let me check my little thing here. 26 degrees, which is like unheard of. It's like really, really rare. Usually it's like 15 degrees and cloudy, or like 18 degrees
Yeah.
in summer. Now it's
Yeah.
26. So it's pretty good. So I've been chilling, gonna get some sun later, going to my hot tub. Enjoy the few days of the year in this country where we get that while it lasts, because yeah, it's
Yeah.
super rare.
It's amazing that people ever even settled in that part of the world with that kind of weather.
Yeah, well, probably like the Neanderthals did first, right? Because they were more adapted to it, and then Homo
Yeah.
sapiens just came in and were like, "What is this horrible climate, and how do you guys actually live here?" And then somehow they just learned to, I don't know, eat enough haggis and turnips that
Yeah.
they were able to survive. So
Mhm.
you had some thoughts about poker goals today, which I think is an excellent topic,
Yeah.
actually. You also pointed out before we began recording that in poker, you know, it's not so easy just to set a goal like you would in life. Like if I want to set a goal for my business, I can be like, okay, well, if I record 10 episodes of grade E of the Carrot Poker School and I give them to my editor with a time frame, probably they'll be edited and then I will have them and I'll be able to put them on the site and start selling them. And the goal of getting that live by August or whatever, which is my current goal, there's not that many moving parts. There's a bit of variance that can go wrong, but I know what those factors are and I can have contingency plans and plan Bs and things like
Mhm.
that. I'm sure with your job and your life as well, your planning is generally quite if X then Y, so I'll do X. But in
Mhm.
poker, as you pointed out, there's all this volatility in the short term, and it leaves us wondering what are goals that are actually sustainable over certain time frames. Like what are good short term goals, what are good mid term goals, and what are good long term goals. So let's have a chat about that today.
Sure. Yeah, I find myself constantly setting kind of like setting these goals that I think are I don't think they're necessarily bad, but they don't seem to fit with what poker is. So similar to um other activities outside of my life, I can say I'm going to have a goal of like I'm going to run 3 times a week, um for the next like 4 weeks, and just kind of see where it gets me, see how I feel, et cetera, et cetera. And that's 100% within my control. Like it's up to me, barring some kind of illness or something or an injury, it's up to me to get up in the morning and go out and run. um but with poker, I can say, well, my goal is by the end of this summer, I'm going to be at X bank. My bankroll is going to be at X, and I'm going to be playing, exclusively 510, or something like that. And that's like in poker, that's a ridiculous goal, in
Mhm.
my opinion. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's setting, not only is it more than appropriately like reliant on variance, but also it's setting myself up for a kind of mental and maybe even financial disaster, because how am I going to feel when I don't achieve that? Number one. Number two is that going to influence my play in the short term to kind of um, play in a way that I wouldn't normally play in order to achieve this goal, and which both those things can be really dangerous. But I also feel on the flip side, like it's important to have goals. I don't know any activity in my life that doesn't involve some goals that I'm setting out for myself, or something that I want to achieve, or some kind of marker of progress. So I get lost a little bit trying to figure out, okay, what is a good marker of progress? We've talked about before on the show, like how do you know if you're good at poker? But beyond that, how do we know whether the goals we're setting are the right goals? Um, I have some thoughts, but I wanted to just kind of start to just framing the conversation with that kind of introduction.
Yeah, I think it's an easy thing to get wrong. And I've definitely worked with students before that have real impatience about goal setting. So they'll be like, right, I want to be at 100 NL by July, and it's like January, and they're playing 10 NL or something like that, and they're like, how realistic is this? And I'd say something like, well, one, it's not likely, like not many people could do that, like in just 5 months, like ascend 3 online stakes if you're currently not beating 10 NL to beat 100. It's pretty unlikely, but with coaching we can give it a bash. But then, like, even if we do improve your game, like, I don't know what your mental game issues are, I don't know what your volatility is like on that front. And then it depends what variance does to you as well, because let's say this is someone who's going to play like 30,000 hands a month. They're gonna grind, I don't know, 100, 150k in this time frame. There's quite a few different ways that can go down, depending on how you run at various points, how your own life goes, what version of yourself you're able to bring to the tables. There's just loads of factors, internal and external, to direct variance that can affect your prospects there. So I think that's invariably a mistake to set a goal in the short to mid-term that is about moving up in stakes or playing a certain game or having a certain bankroll. I think your point about that being maddening as well, it's not just that it's out of your hands and it relies more on variance than we would be comfortable with, but it also just is insanity provoking, and you're putting your back against the wall there. You're really backing yourself into a corner, and, you know, cornered animals are the most instinctive and irrational, and usually instincts and irrationality are not traits that we really want when we're grinding a career out in poker. So we want to stabilize the ship in the short term as much as we can, and to do that, I think we have to have much more process-driven short-term goals and save the what do I want out of the game, where would I like to be in the long term. They should be indefinite time frame goals. I don't even think we should say in exactly 2 years, because that feels kind of arbitrary, but maybe we could say, in my poker career, I would like to move up to X stake. I would like to play 5-10 live. I would like to travel. I'd like to play like some tournaments, 1K buy-in tournaments, whatever it may be. I think that would be okay, but to even say like this time next year I want to be at X, I think that's like, it feels like a long-term goal, because like usually in life something that is a year away is something that's long-term that we're planning for. But I don't actually think that is a long time. I think in a year you can have lots of different years based on your volatility and variance, and even that I think is a bit of a push. So my first point here would just be, make the short and mid-term goals, and by mid-term I mean even something like a year or 2 years, more process driven. And then the long-term goal of like what you would like out of the game should be kept quite general, and it should be more like, in many years I would love to achieve X. And I think that should actually act more as your inspiration, something that like kickstarts the engine of your poker career and keeps you coming back and keeps the fire burning each day, like restokes the flames, than it should be something that like you're directly aiming for in some kind of actual objective short-term way. So that would be the first thing I would say. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what would be some good short-term or mid-term goals if they aren't things like play 5-10 or have a bankroll of 50k.
Yeah. How about something like, I'm going to spend X amount of time playing poker this week. So no matter what results are happening, this is the time I'm going to spend. And maybe I'll spend more than that if I'm feeling like I'm accessing my A game, things are going really well, you know, I'll leave that open. But under no circumstances, barring, you know, some extreme circumstance, I'm not going to quit. I'm not going to walk away if I've had 2 or 3 bad sessions, if I'm down 3 or 4 buy-ins, whatever. I'm going to kind of force myself to engage with the game over a certain period of time, to deal with the variance, to kind of separate myself from my results in the short term. So I think that seems to me a good goal. That's a goal that I set for myself. And to be honest with you, I set that goal at the beginning of every session. I have like, today I'm going to play, you know, as divorced from the kind of variance, the results as possible, to try and access that kind of just, you know, that A game state. I think there's more nuance to it than that, but in general, like, I think that's maybe like a short-term goal that we can think about.
Yeah, I think that's great. One good thing about that sort of goal is it actually helps you fight through what is one of the biggest roadblocks for people learning the game. In my mental game book, Poker Therapy, I make the distinction between a misfire and a roadblock. And a misfire is something that your brain is just activating the wrong mental program at the wrong time. Basically, a trigger that should cause Y program is actually causing X. Maybe it's like mode 2 thinking, like we've discussed previously, desires trying to affect certain states of affairs instead of looking at objectivity, something like that. that's actually going on. And that's treated by rewiring, right? Just learning like, okay, which program do I have to use here? Why do I not have to use the bad one? How can I bring the good one in? How do I practice that, rehearse that, get that in place? That's not so bad to do, but it does take dedication, commitment, that sort of thing. Now, roadblocks that we talk about at the end of the book, these are more like personal life traps for you as your life relates to poker and as you exist within poker. So it's like the relationship between you as you are deeply wired as an individual and poker. It's more like character traits, like actual genuinely deeply ingrained things, rather than just like the brain is using the wrong mode of operation. So one of the roadblocks is actually like an aversion to volume, that whenever you play a lot of volume, you go insane. Not you personally, Melissa, but like many students of mine have been this way, that they can keep it together when they're playing like 3 days a week, part-time. Maybe they can play like 20k hands a month and keep it together. But when they try to play 50, you know, the wagon just falls apart and they lose control of their normal disciplined habits and just end up being way lower EV and having a really unpleasant, torrid experience at the same time. So what your goal kind of gets you to do, I guess, is it says poker will often treat you badly. It will never be smooth sailing like indefinitely. There might be periods where it feels like you're invincible and you're sailing really smoothly and the waves are low, but the storm is always going to pick up. And that kind of goal kind of says, come what may, rain or shine, I'm going to still be here at the end of it. And that's a really cool goal, because if we elongate that out over the course of a poker player's career, like who is the player that's actually survived when 5 of their peers have failed? If you say like 1 in 6 people that embarks on a serious attempt to make this their livelihood succeeds, then I think the numbers are something like that. If we're talking about really committed, serious people, still most of them fail. But what does the 1 in 6 really have that the others don't? And it's a kind of grit to be there at the end, to have a bad year but still be in the game, to not let a 2-month downswing put them off entirely, to be able to be 30 buy-ins below their previous peak on an online graph and still show up and play something akin to their A or B game. So your goal is great for that, because you're kind of saying, this is non-negotiable. This is a contractual thing that I've agreed with myself in advance, and I don't therefore just get to go, oh, do you know what? I'm feeling bruised. I'm feeling vulnerable. This isn't enjoyable. I'm card dead. I'm losing. I'm going to quit for the week. I'll come back next week. If you make a habit out of that, you play, I don't know, 100 hours in a year instead of 600 or something like that. You know, you play dramatically less hours than you set out to. So that's a wonderful goal, because it conquers that aversion to volume, and eventually you will develop a skin. You know, it's like if you're in the public eye, if you're a politician or something, you're getting like eggs thrown at you as you walk down the street or something like that. That's going to suck, but eventually you'll build up more of a skin. If you're a Twitch streamer, you get abuse from the chat, eventually you build up more of a tolerance. If you're a poker player, you have to build that thick skin. You have to survive the onslaughts, and you still have to be there. Maybe you're drenched in the rain, but you're still there doing your job, and then when the sun comes out, you've put in loads of volume where others haven't. I think it's a great goal.
Yeah I think there's a lot to showing up for sure. And I think that's, forget who said it, there's a famous quote that's like 90% of success is just like showing up. but yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I think that I had an interesting kind of conversation this weekend in a live game. A player who I would call him somewhat of a, you know, reg, I guess. I mean, he seems to have been playing a lot over the last like 3 months. I've been seeing him pretty much every time I'm in the card room, he's there. And I don't know exactly how he was doing, but from my just looking at his stack and kind of watching how he's playing, like he seemed to be doing pretty well. And so I thought, okay, well, you know, that's good for him, I guess, but he seemed to always kind of be in a good mood, and he was always joking around, and he was actually really fun to play with, because he also had a really good sense of humor, and he was like one of the few people that I actually find like legitimately like funny that I play with, that like actually makes like funny jokes and is like interesting to talk to. So anyways, the other day he sat down next to me and he was like really distraught, and he's just like, poker is just not fun anymore. He's like, it's just not fun. He's like, I had like the last like 3 months have been so great. He's like, come in, have a good time, have a few drinks. It's like, he's like, I've been winning. And he's like, I know I'm not the greatest player. He's like, I don't spend a lot of time studying or anything, but he goes, at least it was fun. He goes, now it just sucks. It's just not fun at all. And this always puts me into a weird spot, because I immediately want to access the kind of experience, knowledge, whatever I have, and it comes to mental game things. But this is also an opponent at the table, so so I don't tell him that. And I basically just said to him, well, that's poker, whatever variance, like maybe you need to take some time off, which is not what I would recommend. Like, you shouldn't take time off, but I just said that because we were sitting next to each other in the middle of a session, and I don't like talking strategy, advice, mental game stuff in a session. But it was interesting to me because it was clear in that moment that he had never really suffered as a poker player. Never, like never. And he wasn't a rank amateur. It wasn't like he had just started playing. He'd been playing on and off for a couple of years. He had maybe won some tournaments. He had had some success. And I think like he clearly had been running pretty well throughout his, the times he'd been playing poker for the last 3 months. And he had really hit a roadblock, and it was just destroying him. And I have not seen him since. I mean, I've played a couple times since then, and I have not seen him. He's obviously not playing on his usual schedule. So I think this kind of, if you're not prepared for that first whack, if you're not able to endure that, that's okay. I mean, maybe you're the kind of player that just wants to play recreationally and, enjoy yourself. I doubt we have a lot of those types of players listening, but if we do, maybe you are, and I don't think this is necessarily for that type of player. But if you're someone who's, wants to be serious about poker, is serious about poker, and wants to kind of sustain, a long-term poker playing career, whether that's professionally or not, like I just feel like you have to be prepared for that, but you also have to get through that, and it can be awful. And so I just thought that was interesting to kind of see that happen to someone that I've watched play for a little while, and to see the effect it had. But you see a lot of this in live poker because where I live, there's not a ton of rooms to play, but there's like a handful. So you see the same pool of players, you see the same people. And there's a lot of people who you see for usually it's about 3 months. Sometimes it's a little bit longer, sometimes a little shorter. They show up, they run really well, they love it. Then that turns, they lose, and you never see them again. And literally that happens so much. It's kind of like a revolving cycle. And then maybe they show up 6 or 8 months later.
Yep.
And they're going to give it another shot.
And online it happens as well. It just happens as a much shorter turnaround in that cycle. Like the online cycle is probably 3 weeks of winning, 1 week of catastrophic losing, quitting the game, something like that, coming back in a couple of months, doing it all over again. So yeah, it's hard to know what your baseline luck is when you've only been playing a couple of years and you've just been winning for a large part of the last year without studying, without really trying. It's easy to see in hindsight and objectively speaking from a bird's eye view how clearly you were running good now during that time. You've not worked at your game. Why do you expect just to show up and have better results than almost everybody else? But still, the brain doesn't want to make the association that the success that it's experiencing is largely down to luck. It doesn't want to admit that, partially because in life, when you do well, it usually is because you've genuinely done well and deserved it. None of the success that people have in their careers, it just comes from nowhere, right? Sometimes they get lucky breaks or whatever, or opportunities present themselves, but hard work and graft and making the right choices, that's what makes somebody a CEO of a successful company or something like that, for example. Opportunistically taking advantage of those times. So for the poker player, it's really easy to think that either you're just amazing when you're running like God, and that's the norm, and that's what you're entitled to, and that's what you expect, or that you're just hopeless. If you start your career and you're actually quite good at poker, but you just run god awful for the first 9 months that you play or something like that, chances are you're gone. 5 years from now, how many of them still exist? Not many. Yeah. So I'm one of those too, by the way, because if I always tell the story, if I hadn't ran like God in 2010, the year where I just couldn't lose a pot, literally, if a pot was to be played, my hand was going to somehow win, or I was going to make my opponent fold. It was one of those years, and it was the start of my career. It was this budding youngster full of optimism. I don't think I would have made this my whole enterprise, my whole business, if I hadn't had that year. I really don't. If that year had been a year of real run bad, I'd probably have gone, shit, I need to do something with my life here. I need to stop entertaining these pipe dreams of making it in poker, because that's what I used to suspect that they were. So it really is just so difficult to know what your norm is until you've gone through all sides of it and everything in between. So until you've ran really well, experienced that, and then experienced the ending and the opposite happening, you don't really know who you are as a player. And until you've experienced like long periods of just performing normally as well, you also don't know what your baseline is. So that is one thing that makes it almost impossible to achieve that volume goal that you outlined, is if you have a flawed impression of what your expectation is in the game, it makes it almost impossible to carry out that goal, in my opinion. Because imagine this guy thinking that his expectation is to be a winner in the game. He knows he's not going to win every session. He's okay with that, but he thinks that in a month he's just going to win money. That's what poker is. He's going to have a nice time and he doesn't have to try that hard. And then, like, how do you then set a goal of, I'm going to play X hours over the next 3 months, when you get brutalized like for 2 weeks, like when you start that? Like, how do you possibly come back? Because it's not just that it hurts, it's that your whole world, your whole mental emporium of what it's like, you as the poker player, what that is, that reality has been knocked down like a house of cards, and now you don't know where up is and you're just all over the place. So I can imagine that you do have to go through that, not just once, but multiple times in order to get to the point where you are the battle-hardened reg that's still there in 12 years when everyone else is off doing something else.
Right. And I think with setting goals, a big, like an important part of it is understanding what is in your control and what isn't. So when you talk about, you know, your example of like, well, you don't know like what your baseline is until you've put in like a significant amount of volume over a number of years, and it's hard to tell whether you can make, you know, you're actually like just running bad or just running good or whatever. Well, one of the things you can do is you have control over yourself. So you have control, like no matter what's happening with the cards and the variance of the game and the other players, you physically are there every time. So you are the one consistent thing. You are the one thing that you have control over. So another goal that I think about sometimes is like, today or in this next session, you know, well, we've talked about the mental game stuff. There's definitely mental game goals that you can say, today, I'm not going to, you know, I'm going to try my best not to tilt. I'm going to try my best to remain focused, et cetera, et cetera. But I think practically you can have like very specific goals. Like, my goal for today is that when I'm facing a river bet, I'm not going to snap, react, animal brain, call, fold, whatever, jam all in. I'm going to stop and I'm going to say, how much is this bet for? How much is the pot? You know, what is, you know, what am I actually getting here on a call? You know, how should I be thinking about this? You know, what percentage of his or her range or bluffs to value, et cetera, et cetera. Just going through this kind of routine of like thinking about, you know, putting it through the filter, even if it's like a really obvious spot, even if it's like, okay, I have a set here, or like I have a full house, I'm never folding. Instead of snap calling and, you know, showing down, pausing and just forcing yourself to go through that thought process to build that kind of wiring within yourself is like, I think a really good goal, and something that is completely 100% achievable, no matter what kind of day you're having, no matter what the cards are doing. So like today, my goal is I'm going to make sure that I go through the proper thought process when facing a river bet. I'm going to make sure that I go through the proper thought process when deciding whether to c-bet. I'm not going to just monkey bet because it's an ace high flop and I'm the pre-flop raiser and I think I have a range advantage. All of these things, you know, like I'm going to actually engage with the world of poker as a live organic thing. I'm not going to just press buttons like someone that is, you know, a trained monkey and expecting, you know, if X equals Y, then I get Z.
But most people are trained monkeys, Melissa. Most poker players want to learn poker in a way that makes them a monkey just banging a tambourine. Like when you look at GTO Wizard or something, like the way it teaches the game, it's like, no, this is 40%, not 33% in this spot. And it's sort of like nitpicking things that really don't matter in the way it visually displays. And Pio does that too. Any solver does that it churns out an output that is visually almost making it seem like a huge deal that you use like mostly this bet but not this bet. And when you don't understand what the game's about because you're in the habit of not thinking about it, you can become a GTO zombie. You can also become an exploitative zombie by just going, oh, they never fold here, they never bluff here, they always bluff here. Oh, this line doesn't make sense. You can spin the yarn exploitatively or theoretically, and either way there's a huge temptation there to bypass thinking. So I think that goal of, I am going to stop, I'm going to see myself as an entity that's reacting and relating to the game of poker. I'm going to see the game of poker as an independent entity from me that has truths. It has objective, concrete truths and falsehoods. And I'm then going to see if I can figure out enough about that in a relevant way to make my decision. And like having a goal, like I'm going to stop and do that every time I face a bet. That's an amazing goal, because it's not just making you play better in that session. Poker players are also so short-sighted. I feel like I should be a stand-up comic about poker players, right? As a poker player, I have a license to take the piss out of them, right? So I can say something like, poker players are always doing this. I'm picturing like a Chris Rock kind of routine here. I feel like I should do this. But they're so short-sighted. Sometimes they're like, oh yeah, man, I'm so proud of myself because today I showed up and I was like, I'm going to think about everything on the river. And I thought about everything on the river. And then their friend's like, oh yeah, that's amazing. Then the next day they show up and they just click buttons again. And it's like, well, what was the point? Well, the problem was that you didn't see that as habit building. You didn't ask yourself, how long does it take to set a new habit? Humans are habitual. We're not creatures that just go out and like do one thing right once and then that's that set in stone. Yet poker players think that if they can do something once that they're now cured. Oh man, I'm so happy I played my A game. Thanks so much for curing me. I'm so glad I took up coaching. Like, you have no idea what it means to me, how much of a turnaround. I'm like, shut up, man. You're not better yet. You're still a tilt monkey. You ran good in that session. You've not been tested yet. You've not been through the tough times. You've not endured. Until you've said, I'm going to do this when I'm running bad. Until you've been able to sit there 10 sessions out of 12 while running bad and stop and think in 10 sessions out of 12. Okay, if you've done that, well, maybe you're part of the way to forming a new habit. If you've done it once, you're kidding yourself that you've actually treated anything or achieved a goal. And you're kidding yourself that you even have the right intentions in the first place. The goal should never be do X one day. The goal should be do X one day in order to take the first step in forming the habit Y that's going to create result C. And that's how we need to see poker. We're actually molding ourselves into habitual creatures that have the right habits and not the wrong ones. So every time you successfully exhibit action consistent with the right habits, you take a step along that road. So I think we could maybe add here to our list of goals that one is more of a virtue ethics kind of position rather than like a utilitarian do the right thing that leads to the right consequences. Maybe we say, who do I want to be? Not just how do I want to be, but who do I want to be? Do I want to be someone who that one day when they're really motivated can show up and play well? Or do I want to be someone who usually plays well because it's inconsistent for me not to? That's a virtue ethics approach. I am reliable. I am diligent. I am responsible. I am in control. I see poker in this way. That's who you are. So I think way too many goals are all about what to do, and like they're very momentary and tunnel visioned and short-term focused, when realistically you're sculpting yourself as a player for the rest of the career, the rest of your poker career. So how are you going to sculpt yourself? Who do you need to be that 1 in 6 that's still standing in 2 years' time?
Yeah. I think that's really important. In fact, I was going to suggest like another idea for, I think this could be an entire episode of like, what kind of like, who do you want to be as a poker player? Like maybe we can talk about that in a future episode, because I think there's so much that goes into that. You know, not only the ethics of it, but also the way that you choose to engage with others, you know, both at the table, on social media. I mean, we see a lot of, I think, professional players who, you know, engage on social media or use social media in ways that I think are, you know, unethical or, you know, borderline
say
kind
toxic.
Of
say toxic.
Yeah, toxic. Yeah, toxic, I guess you could say. So anyways, but I think that's a little bit of another topic, and I also feel like it deserves its own episode. So let's maybe flag that for another day. But on the point of like you know, habit forming and all of that, I think that that's so important, because you know, you're fighting as a poker player, you're constantly struggling with short-term thinking, you're constantly engaged in this kind of in this game that tells you that short-term results matter, that this is an indication of the truth of what's actually happening here. And you're reminding yourself that no, that's a facade. That's just a trick. That's just the smoke and mirrors of the game, that there's a long-term goal here, and that you're a long-term player, and that you're a long-term thinker, but that does not come naturally. And I think, yes, it requires constant work, and I think it also requires constant, habit building to do well. The other thing I was going to say is that another goal would be something like, for me at least, I would say one of my biggest leaks is that my thought process will prioritize certain elements that I see. So like, similar to the way that like our own like internal kind of bias works towards certain things, we receive a bunch of input from the world, but we have to prioritize certain things in order to survive. The same thing at a poker table. It's like we're constantly receiving input, and when we're making a decision, we are weighing a bunch of different factors. And I think a lot of times I prioritize the wrong factor, or I'll prioritize one factor as the primary factor at the expense of all the other ones. So I think, this is a really, like, an example of this is like, okay, I'm in a pot with, a player who hasn't played a lot of hands. So therefore there's no way he's bluffing in this spot. I fold. Like that's in my opinion, like, you're prioritizing one factor, which is the fact that hasn't entered a lot of pots. Now that may be the right factor. It may be the most relevant factor, but it's not the only factor. And to prioritize that immediately without weighing all the others is, kind of giving into an easy bias, giving into an easy kind of short-term input, saying because of X, that means Y. And I think a really good goal that is another one of these, we can kind of put it into the bucket of like habit forming goals, is to stop, to interrupt the thought process, to interrupt that natural instinct we have toward prioritizing what is most threatening to us, that kind of fight or flight reaction, and to stop and say, no, that's one element in this hand. What else is happening here? Well, okay, he's, on the button, he's not under the gun. Okay, that makes a difference. Or, what do I think his range is here? Not what do I think he has, because he bet on a king high flop, it means he has a king. All of these things that kind of can be really effective as a long-term goal of, again, not playing poker like a monkey pressing buttons, but engaging in like poker wants you to be fully engaged. It requires you to be fully engaged. It wants you to treat it like a living thing. It doesn't want you to treat it as a kind of, like rote machine. And engaging with a living thing, just like when you engage with other human beings, is like difficult and unpredictable and all these other things, but you have to at least give it that baseline respect. And that's, I think, something that I struggle with a lot. I still struggle with it. I made this mistake last night where, I made it a 3-bet, prioritizing one factor over all the other ones, and it was a mistake. And so I constantly struggle with this, but I think it's an important goal.
Yeah. Like, why has religion been character forming and a central pillar of all societies since like the agricultural revolution, and even like prior to that? Like, why is this the case? It's because it not only gives you like the constructs of like the ontological constructs of like there's God and there's you and there's all these structures, and I'm more atheist than anything else, as I've told you before, so I'm not like a religious person, but I can see the merit of that, and I can also see the merit in this like, who does God want me to be kind of thing. Like, a lot of people who are religious use like the interpretation of God as a sense of accountability. Like, there's someone or something way more powerful and way more important than them that matters way more, to whom they have to be a certain type of person, or for whom is a better way to put it, they have to be a certain type of person. And that actually works really well for humans, because we are pack animals. We are very good at being a certain way for one another. We're very good at like being there for one another when we're in times of need. We're very good at looking after our immediate inner circle of friends and family, for example. So I think we need to do that with poker as well. We need to say, okay, maybe poker is this higher being, it's this like higher power almost, and it is an organic moving thing, as you said, Melissa, because who makes up a poker table? It's all humans, right? So when you're playing poker, you're playing against humans. So of course, poker isn't just this rigid rote machine. But maybe when you're playing with Pile Solver, you are actually interacting with a rote machine. Like when you're in a GTO trainer, that's more what you're doing. But in real life, you can practice with the machine, but then you have to do a lot of real life play. You have to practice your exploitative faculties and your exploitative thinking. as well. And in doing so, I think what you're really doing is you're holding yourself to a certain standard. You're kind of saying, poker is this amazing thing that I've devoted so much of my life to because I really admire it. I almost worship it. I think it's like this incredible, fascinating thing. It's funny because last night on the ride home from the bridge club with my friend, I was like, poker is such a bad game compared to bridge. Like, it really is, but that's another story. But it is a beautiful game when you're not card dead for 5 hours folding 9 deuce off, and when you're involved playing a 6 max session of Zoom with 4 tables and you're playing your A game and your brain's working. There's nothing like it. It is a really beautiful thing. So let's hold it in that really high regard. Let's remember the inspiration that got us involved in it in the first place, and let's have some commandments of who we should be, not just what we should do, but who we should be. I know in Christianity, most of the 10 commandments are more about what you should do. They're like, thou shalt not kill, don't covet, don't steal your neighbor's wife, and stuff like this, right? I don't know what they are, but it's mainly stuff along those lines. Don't bash Fred across the head with a club just to have his meat. Things like this that kept societies, tribal societies, in line at that point and made them more civilized. So how do we make ourselves more civilized in poker? How do we avoid being the kind of marauding tribe member that's just like bashing other tribes? Chimpanzees we've talked about a lot. They go out with their territory, they shred another chimp outside the territory, absolutely mutilate them, eat them, come back, go about their day and start grooming their mate again. Like, it's a sick life being a chimp. But how do we move away from chimphood, and how do we become like evolved humans in poker? Well, first we need something to actually care about other than ourselves. We need this external standard. Like, one of the things that's so wrong with modern society, in my opinion, and in the opinions of all the podcasts I listen to and I'm brainwashed by, is obviously this idea that we're all just narcissists. It's all individualism. Like, we're all locking ourselves in our own little boxes and just trying to make that work for us. And I think there's a hell of a lot wrong with that in society. It's a big problem with consumerism, where we just want all the best thing for ourselves. It's a huge problem. I think it's a huge problem in poker as well. If you can start to see poker as something that actually, like you said, demands that you are the best version of yourself possible, I think it's way easier to actually grow. Like, I've been focusing a lot more in recent years on who I want to become in this phase of my life. There's this guy called Erickson, and he talks about the phases of man. And my therapist a few years ago, when I was going there regularly, kind of told me about Erickson, how you can be stuck in one phase of life if you don't make the necessary adaptations to your thought process and who you actually see yourself as. So it's not uncommon for kids that have trauma or whatnot to get stuck in adolescence and be a 16-year-old forever or something like that. And it got me thinking, like, I wonder if there are poker players who are stuck in animalistic, tribal, sort of primitive poker player mode for their entire career. Like, look at Helmuth. Like, has he ever grown out of exploding and playing his F game randomly because one thing goes wrong? No. Like, he's never been able to mold himself into somebody who doesn't do that, right? It would seem. He's talking about burning casinos down even recently. So I think there's loads of players that get stuck like that. So what can propel us along the path? What can make us become the version of ourselves that poker demands that we are? I think that whole moral authority, that appeal to poker as this thing that we really, really want to interact well with, is a great one. There's other things too. You could also just say, well, who do I want to be anyway? And then how would that fit into poker? Oh, I want to be a responsible, diligent person. I want to be able to hold myself to certain standards, and I want to be able to follow through on things. I want to be able to finish things. That's really important. There's this quote, your success is defined by your ability to finish things, right? Don't remember who said it, but it's a pretty well-known quote. And say you just take that one axiom and you just say, I want to be someone who finishes things, period. So if I start building a shed, I finish the damn shed. If I start reading a book, I finish the fucking book. If I start playing 10k hands one week and say that's my job this week, I'll finish the 10k sample, rain or shine. Yeah, I think this is like the virtue ethics of poker. I think this is a way better approach than just this rote utilitarian. What do I do? What should I do? No, who do I want to be, and who does poker want me to be? I love the way that you sort of introduced that. Yeah.
But it's not just what can I take from poker. It's like, what do I have to do for poker?
Right.
So this idea of like, what makes a winning player, well, I'm crushing. A lot of players say like, I'm crushing 1-2 or I'm crushing 2-5 or whatever. I crush that game. And I know we've talked about that word crush before, but like, even so, like, I'm beating this, I'm beating I'm beating these stakes, or I've achieved X, or I've won this tournament. And it's like, all of these things that you're taking away from poker, but what do you have to give to poker? What do you owe poker? And I'm not talking about in the really cheesy way, like I owe poker, like I have to then, I've been very successful financially, so that it means I have to donate my money to a certain charity. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, what do you owe this thing that you're devoted to and that you're trying to master, that's given you this kind of direction in life. I think if you're a serious poker player, if you're devoted to the game, if you're trying to get better, you should feel extremely lucky because you have something that you love. A lot of people in life don't have something they love. A lot of people in life wake up every day and just trying to get to the end of the day. They get up, they go to work, they come home, they have they kiss their husband or wife, they see their kids, and like that's it. That's all they do. There's a documentary right now on Netflix that's about Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I watched the first episode the other day, and I loved it. I loved it because I've actually never really, like, I don't know much about him, and like, I mean, I've seen his movies and I know who he is and everything, but like, and I knew that he was a bodybuilder, but I didn't know that he was born in Austria, kind of this like mountain town. He had like a really abusive childhood. His father was like a real disciplinarian, like violent, kind of an alcoholic. His mother was a little bit crazy, and like him and his brother were like, had this really difficult childhood, and actually ended up killing his brother. His brother died of alcoholism when he was in his 20s, drunk driving accident. But like Arnold kind of survived, and he got out of Austria and he became this bodybuilder, and then moved to Hollywood, and the rest is history. But one of the things he says that's so interesting in the beginning of the movie is he says that ever since he was very young, he could always visualize, he could clearly visualize goals for himself, and he could clearly visualize himself in different situations than he was presently in. And he said, if I could visualize it, I knew it was achievable. And that was kind of like his mantra. And treating his goals as achievable because he could visualize them really got him and drove him to kind of work harder than everybody else and achieve, the impossible of kind of getting out of this, literally he grew up in like the middle of nowhere in the mountains of Austria. It's really incredible. And I think bringing this back to poker, I connected with it because I feel like if you're someone that's lucky enough to have goals, to have a desire to achieve something beyond just your normal everyday life, and I'm sure everyone listening to this understands what I'm saying. You have friends that maybe you grew up with or you went to high school with who are leading very quote unquote normal lives, who maybe seem to have a kind of, very straight and narrow path. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm not saying they're necessarily happy, but at least on the surface, it's kind of like what you're supposed to be doing. I'm like very glad that I'm not one of those people. And I'm glad that I have this kind of thing that I'm very obsessed over that drives me to kind of want to figure it out, to, that makes life interesting to me. That's a really good thing to have. So what do you, in exchange for that, what does that mean? It means that you owe something back to poker. And so what do you owe to poker? Well, you owe it, like you just said, trying to be I love this idea of like being a more civilized player, like bringing civilization to yourself, holding yourself to a higher standard, not because you think it's necessarily plus EV. I think it is, but beyond that, I also think because the game deserves that and demands that. And I think it's true and correct.
Yeah. And sometimes it has to get worse before it gets better. When you start changing yourself, sometimes you have to become an inferior version of yourself before you become a superior version. Like if you think about, again, on the front of like civilizing humanity, if you imagine like back in the day when they were just like nomadic tribes wandering around, like hunting and picking up berries and going from place to place, knowing that mushroom was good and that one was bad, that was probably an okay life. Like, okay, yeah, you're not going to live like as long as we do today. You're not going to have as many options in the form of like entertainment and stuff. But I'd imagine it's kind of a happy, natural life, like to be a hunter-gatherer and when things are good and just like wandering around. Then you have like industrialization and like the agriculture revolution. You have peasants toiling for like 16 hours a day, kids all dying of disease, like overcrowded tenements, like you name it, like all of this stuff from, you know, the last few thousand years. It was actually kind of horrific. And it's only actually in the last like 100 years or so that you can say that the standard of life has really started to spike. Like your access to like healthcare, societies, how stable they are in terms of like growing up in a Western society and not being completely oppressed by your government and things like that. These are all like fairly recent things. And so I think like in a poker career, it takes a long time to actually civilize yourself to go to this point, because you start out as this wild animal that's just like, I won for 3 months, I'm fantastic, I'm on top of the world, I'm king. And then you hit downswing and you're just this cornered bear, just like lashing out at everyone, destroying your own bankroll. The hands I've seen students play when they're like threatened, insanity, like some like 80 big blind EV punts. It's really hard to punt 80 big blinds in EV with 100 big blind stack. Going all in with 8 deuce off pre doesn't do that, for example, right? Just to put it into the context here. That's not minus 80 big blinds. So I've seen punts on that level. Like people calling in spots that are never bluffed by pool with bluff catchers, where they're losing the full 80 big blinds, like things like that. And in the cold light of day, they look back and they're like, what beast was that? What kind of mad animal played that hand? And the answer is that when you are not a cultivated poker player, when you've not cultivated yourself into the kind of poker player that can withstand that, you revert to natural cornered animal. And natural cornered animal is massively irrational. Massively. Like a fly trying to escape from a room behind a window, thud, 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 bashing their head off the window over and over again. That's what the poker player does when they've not learned to survive the storm. They just basically like thud against the window time and time again. The whole cycle repeats. So my point is here with this long-winded spiel, it takes a bunch of time to achieve a lot of the virtues, or even get along the path to making these habits ingrained enough to achieve these virtues. So if you take the virtue of patience, it takes so long as a live player to cultivate the habit of not getting bored and lashing out. It takes like years to cultivate that. If you take the habit of perseverance, the virtue of perseverance, which is the one that your goal was meant to cultivate, Melissa, right? Your goal was, I'm going to play 5 days this week, 8 hours a day, regardless of what happens. That's the habit of perseverance. So to do that, even doing it 1 week, that gets you part of the way along the path. You're still not even there. So sometimes it gets worse before it gets better. Like if you encounter a bad stretch that you have forced yourself to play, and you've not given yourself the usual out of like running out the fire exit in the middle of the bad stretch, you're going to suffer, and it's going to get really bad, and the storm is going to get really, really strong. The sea is going to get really choppy before it calms down, and you're going to go insane. But if you can muscle on through, if you can keep yourself together, if you can remember who you're trying to be and which version of yourself you're trying to instantiate, eventually you just become that. If you do the same thing over and over again with the same intention in mind, eventually your character actually changes. So if I can avoid getting mad 1 time out of 3, okay, that sucks. I'm still tilting all the time, but what if I get it up to 2 out of 3? Am I still a tilty player? Well, yes. But every time I get that right, every time I don't tilt and I don't punt, even though I could, I get further down the path of making that a permanent character trait. And eventually, the mold hardens, the clay dries up, and it's no longer malleable. And at that point, you have to look back and say, what have I created? Because you're going to reach a point in your 60s where you can no longer mold yourself very effectively at all, where it takes a ton of molding just to move the clay a little bit because it's mostly hardened. When you're young, or even like middle age, you still have the chance to do that to some extent. And the question is, what kind of poker player do you want to be 10 years from now? What kind of habits do you want to have built? Do you still want to be someone threatening to burn down casinos or not?
Right. I really like the idea of, you know, to do any kind of growth requires, you know, this kind of, you have to burn away, you know, a kind of prior version of yourself. Like, so this is like, you know, a very ancient idea of like sacrifice. You know, you have to enter into a sacrifice in order to achieve something. This was like, it's all over the Bible. Like if you have to enter into a covenant with God to achieve something, you know, that's kind of all of the Old Testament is just like full of these covenants that people made with God in order to achieve something. And you know, Peterson has this theory where he talks about how like the one of the greatest achievements in humankind was understanding this idea that like we have to sacrifice our immediate pleasure in order to get something later. So this kind of hedonistic attitude. So like instead of just eating all the food, we understand, well, if we eat half the food and we save some, then when we get hungry later, we'll have some food. We don't have to go out and hunt again. We don't have to eat it all at once. Like this was like a major development. It's like a major advancement in humankind. So I think like this idea of saying, I'm going to make a sacrifice in the present to achieve something later. How do we interpret that? Well, how do we, I think, incorporate that into poker? Well, what is poker telling you to sacrifice? What is it telling you that you have to burn away? And what if instead of saying I'm on this huge downswing, or I've had all these horrible things happen to me in poker. Maybe my bankroll's busted. Maybe I'm broke. What is poker telling me I need to burn away? What is this path that I'm being shown? And I understand this is like very like, lofty thinking, and that in the moment it can be extremely painful and maddening to have to go through the swings of poker. And trust me, like I've been there, at least the first half of this year I was, and I really felt like, like how much more of this can I withstand? And I think instead of thinking of it like that, thinking of it as like, well, what am I being told right now? Like what am I being told that I have to do in order to become the player I want to become? And like, how am I being molded? So like this idea of like, you start off as like a piece of limestone, and the sculptor comes there and and eventually you have, I don't know, David or something, like it's amazing. But like, that's like the first thing I thought of when I think of like a marble sculpture. But the point is that like, there has to be a lot of things chipped away. You have to go through this you have to burn away the excess, and you may be a completely different person at the end of it. And I love this. I love your example of like, well, I tilted 5 out of 5 times. Now I tilt 4 out of 5 times. Okay. That's going to change you. That's going to fundamentally change you. When you're tilting 3 out of 5 times, that's going to fundamentally change you. I've witnessed this. And when it happens and it can be striking. Like, I had a hand this weekend where I had pocket jacks, and this, the flop was like deuce, deuce, 8. And, the guy shows up with eight deuce on the river, and he for a flock full house. It's like, what the hell is he doing in a 3-bet pot with eight deuce? In the past, this would have driven me insane, but I just kind of said nice hand and moved on, and it didn't tilt me at all. I moved on and it didn't affect my session. And I think that in itself was like, once I realized that I did it naturally. It wasn't like, okay, now I have to like put on this like, put on this armor. It was like, no, it was just there. And then like a couple hours later, I was like, holy shit, like that didn't tilt me.
But it's only there really because you did at one point have to put on the armor, right? Like at one point you're really suffering, you've got the armor on, and you're like, I must survive, I must survive, I must survive. And it's hard, but eventually like everything we do, we see that because everything we do is like a performance in a theater where we are the audience, right? So we are always watching ourselves, and we're always gaining self-image every time we do something. So if I, right now just like take this coffee mug and like throw it at the screen angrily and like storm away from the podcast, I've done some real damage to my self-image. It's not just that I've done that once and I have to like apologize to you and say, Melissa, I'm really sorry, I was having a bad day. I don't know if you would accept that apology if I threw the coffee mug at the stream. No, you wouldn't. I didn't think so. No. Just like, no. But yeah, like when I do that and then I wake up the next day, let's say, or a week goes past and I'm doing some other activity, well, I now know that I'm someone that's capable of throwing the coffee mug at the screen and storming off the middle of the podcast. So I'm now like, I don't trust myself. I can just like lose control really easily. My inner child is now like, aha, chaos. Let me grab onto all of that and let me like torture myself and everyone around me by embracing this chaos, because I've seen it happen before. I think we all have these little devils inside of us that are waiting for cracks in the order so that they can actually just like grab on and pull it's a bit like in Stranger Things, the Netflix show. I don't know if you've ever watched that series. There's this alternate reality that exists like underneath the town in which these characters reside, and it's called the Upside Down, and there can be tears in the fabric where like demons and stuff from the upside down and monsters can like come through if someone is like exerted enough like psychic force to create a gate, like a passageway between the two worlds. And I really think that's what it is to be a poker player sometimes as well, because you have order, you're in like the right side up world, everything's fine, and then when variance strikes you, or when you just have a bad day and your self-image changes, it's almost like it flips and you go into the upside down, and now it's all chaos and nothing makes sense anymore. How often do players say everything was going fine but now nothing makes sense, I don't even know how to think about the game anymore? They're literally just thrown into this other universe. So I think that, back to the point in question here, which is that the more orderly decisions you make, the more of these like personal goals you achieve, and the more you instantiate the virtuous characteristics in yourself, the more you're protected from the chaos, the more you're protected from the demon inside you that's ready to like grab onto things and create this harmony. Like, I've been there so many times. Like, my inner demon has definitely thrived when I break down everything else. It's like people do stupid shit when they're drinking, when their inhibitions are lowered, you know, when they're tired, when they don't have enough emotional control. That opens the little crack into that bad world that exists. It's always there, and then it's so easy just to step into it and let the monsters follow you back out again. So your self-image grows with you over time. So the more you make a good, calm, logical decision where others would crumble, you begin to see yourself as someone who can do that. That means that you grow in confidence. You have a load of faith in yourself, and then because you have so much confidence, it's easier to behave optimally. It's just a fact. When you're confident, it's much easier to take the right decision, where that decision requires a lot of willpower, where there may be some innate resistance against it. When you're not confident, when you're doubting yourself, when you're seeing yourself as a volatile creature that can't be trusted, it's really easy to just like be low in confidence, low in self-esteem, and then you make a lot of bad decisions when you're low in self-esteem and low in confidence, for sure. So I would just urge everyone like listening to this, it sounds super preachy, but be aware of yourself at the table. How are you conducting yourself, not just outwardly, but what's your inner narrative like? Does your inner narrative sound like, oh, for God's sake, not this again, of course I missed a flop? That's a tantruming brat. That's chaos. That's like you basically saying, I can't be trusted to be mature enough to process this adversity. That's what you're basically saying to yourself. Or does it sound like, okay, this will happen again, but I'm actually fine with that. I think I played it well. And like, sincerely, like, did you mean that? Because if it's the latter, you didn't just get that right. You didn't just like achieve the utilitarian end of making the right thought process with the best possible EV, but you also grew in through the virtue ethics lens as well, and now you can trust yourself more in future, and now it's actually like it propels your success. It's exponential when you start to see things in a character building way. It's just super hard because when variance is going against you, you end up like that guy at your card room, and it's like that could be a hill that's just too steep to climb. Even if you do have a bit of confidence, it could be too steep. So it does break you down before you build yourself back up again. Poker, it can do that. Yeah,
it does. And I think it takes, it just takes some courage, and it takes an understanding that, an understanding of what the game is and what it isn't. And I think, this was a good overview of that. And I think, in the context of goal setting, I think it was really helpful to kind of name some specific goals today. And, but I think in general, like, it's going to be different for everyone, and understanding what's in your control and what isn't is probably like the overarching, like, most important part of setting goals, and also understanding like how deep you can go with those goals and what they mean. And that it's not just a goal to achieve like, it's not like putting getting a ribbon or just achieving something like that just is like a contest. It's actually like, if you're serious about poker, it's like, life and death. You're engaged in this thing, really it's like a battle for your soul, and you're in there and you're battling every day, and it's going to demand, I think there's days where it's going to demand everything from you, and there's days when it's going to just give you everything. And understanding that, I think, is key. Yeah, I love that. Some days you receive the bounty for all of the stuff that you've done, all of that sacrifice, all of the praying to the totems, all of the slaughtering of goats. Don't recommend slaughtering goats. I have 4 pet pygmy goats. No, we don't milk them. They're not for milk. They're just pets. I don't slaughter goats, but you get the point. All of that is rewarded, and you just get the fruits of your labor. Other days, you suffer. You literally just have to be lashed by the game for like 6 hours straight, and that's not fun.
But yeah, at the end of the day, what you're saying is that, as Peterson says, you're kind of making a covenant with not just you or the higher power of poker or God or whatever it is for you, but with the various iterations of yourself over time, like the future yous that are equally important. You and they are actually forming a society. You're forming agreements. You're forming this ability to look out for one another. So when you show up to the poker game, start running bad, it's not just you and that day that you owe it to play well, and it's not just poker or the higher power or God that you owe it to, it's also your covenant with the future versions of yourself. I'm pretty sure that's how Peterson would perceive online poker if he knew what it was. He probably doesn't know what online poker is, but I'm sure he'd say something like the future yous are depending on you setting a good example by achieving the goals that you've set for yourself, but you can't achieve them if they're the wrong goals. If your goals are, I'm going to win today, then yeah, you're an idiot. You're dead. You're done for. Yeah. You've got no chance. If your goal is, I'm going to be a bit better than I was yesterday when it comes to thinking through spots, okay, that's a good goal. We can work with that. That's a start. But yeah, there's so many other goals we could have outlined here, especially midterm goals, like, you know, more pragmatic things, like what should we expect in terms of moving up stakes? What should we expect in terms of like yearly profit, like these kind of things? And I would say, don't put that much thought into those. Put only as much thought into those as is necessary and never plan around them. You can put them on the top of your structure as like the flag on top that you're aiming towards. It's like the flagpole at the top of the castle turret, but you don't build things on top of the flagpole. You don't use them as foundations to support other goals. Make sure they're at the very top, and if you achieve them, it would be nice. But hey, if you build most of the castle and you don't quite get to erect the flag yet, that's all right as well. You've still got most of the castle. It's you're building, not your results. You're trying to become a better version of yourself. You're not just trying to do things.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to Vegas for the main event or for anything because of that reason. And my, like, I don't know, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, my quote unquote goal was to like go down there and play. It was actually like a plan. I was like, okay, I was going to go down there and play. I wasn't sure if I was going to play any tournaments. I'm not really a tournament player. I may have, but I was mainly going to like play like the mid stakes games, 2-5 and 5-10. But I'm not doing that now. And I'm not doing it because I had a really rough start to the year. My bankroll took a hit. My mental game took a hit. And so I needed to kind of rebuild. And I think having that flexibility to where it's like, okay, I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to like, it's not like I have like a, it's not like I have like a business meeting in Vegas that I have to be to. It's like that was a plan that just didn't work out. It's just not feasible now. And honestly, since making that decision of not to go, it's like this weight off my shoulders. It's like I don't need to achieve anything. It's okay if I have like another couple swings. It's okay like if I'm not running as well as I wanted to, or something's not working, that's okay. So I think that's just like another example of like the way that goals can really be stressful if if they're outside of your control. And that I think being able to have that flexibility of being like, my plan was to go to Vegas for the World Series. Okay, I'm flexible. Doesn't look like that's the best thing, so I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, like, I have a bunch of friends that are down there that I play with, and, all the best of luck to them. But it just wasn't happening for me this year. And that's okay.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons you feel a lot better about it is that you're now being governed by your own choice of goal and not the choice of a previous iteration of yourself. So like you before the downswing, when you were like smooth sailing, you were running really good at the end of last year. You admitted yourself you're not half the player that you are now, but you were just winning due to variance at that point. And maybe you're a winner in the game as well, but you don't have as big a true win rate as you do now, right? And you were crushing at that point. And then the past version of you at that point made this kind of pact, like, okay, given how things are going, it's really reasonable for me to go to Vegas this summer and play 5-10 and play higher stakes, and this is the next step. And this quantifies success for me, even more success based on what's been happening. Then the you of today looks back on that and is like, that's not right anymore. And just as we have to like consider our future selves and we have to be able to make deals with them, we also have to look back on our past selves and say, do your timeframes, standards, goals still apply? Are they still optimal, or am I operating with more information than you had back then, past Pete or past Melissa, when you made the goal in November 2022? And I think you're feeling better because you've brought your goal in sync with the current version of yourself and the future versions of yourselves, not the past version of yourself who didn't have as much information at the point of making that goal. So it's a case of just calibrating. Look at streamers who do like bankroll challenges. How does that work out when someone puts the pressure on themselves of posting on Twitter what their bankroll is and stuff like that? All the students I know that have tried that have literally gone insane and just stopped it. They found it too much pressure because it now feels like they've set this arbitrary time frame. Like, this month I do a bankroll challenge, and at the end of the month, if their bankroll is like they've had a bad month, it's just too much pressure. It feels like they're being governed by something that's totally out with their control. So yeah,
totally,
control is so key.
Absolutely. And this, I've fell prey to this too. It's like you feel like, okay, my bankroll can't dip below a certain amount, and so you feel yourself approaching that amount, and it starts affecting the way you play. And like I would find myself more prone to tilt because I felt like I was approaching this kind of cliff. It's like once I go over that cliff, it's all over. And it's like, well, no, like I still have like enough, I still have more than enough to play. Like I'm, it may require some more investment outside of poker, but it's not the end of the world. But your brain tells you that, and it affects how you play. And I think that that can be, it can be disastrous. And so the less, don't there's no point in making things harder than they already are, like on yourself. And those kinds of goals, those kinds of challenges can absolutely do that. I had another point that what you were saying made me think of it, but now I lost it. Yeah, I don't know. I'll remember it next time, and I'll bring it up in our next week's episode.
Cool. So this has been a really fruitful discussion. I think we've kind of gone on some tangents here, but they've been quite relevant ones this time. They've not been like totally like random ones. So just to summarize, I guess what we're really saying is that it's who you become in the long term. It's the future versions of yourself. It's your own self-image at the poker table. That's what really helps you achieve your goals. And if you are going to have results-based goals, like move up to 510 or take a trip, blah, 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 you should actually put them off for as long as possible. You should make them really long-term things such that regardless of how you run within a reasonable, deviation, you're likely to achieve them. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where your goal can only be achieved 65% of the time if you do everything right. That's a really bad goal to have. And then we've talked about short-term goals just being things like process, just like gradual improvement. Sometimes it has to get bad before it gets good. But at the end of the day, every step you take towards ingraining the right habit is going to make you more of the kind of person that can have that habit ultimately and can achieve that process-oriented short-term goal. So, cool discussion. We'll be back with more Poker Distilled this week. I'm still not being trolled very much, so there's just really nothing to report on that front. Maybe next week, Melissa will try and get a segment.
I think that you're... I think you calling them out maybe reduce the amount of trolls, because I don't want to be featured on the show.
Yeah, I think they're like the really lame ghosts you get that when you shine the torch on them, they just sort of like splinter into like 1,000 pieces and disappear. So if there's anyone out there that's like grossly offended by this conversation that wants to like take shots at us, then go ahead. At least you'll give us some material for next week. It's cute how sometimes people fake troll. They're like, oh, Pete, I want to be on Pete versus Troll and I love your content, so I'm going to say this one slightly not even mean, just like slightly contentious thing, and then that doesn't really cut it because we're trying to capture the really vitriolic toxin of the troll. So if you're not that, you're not going to make it on. Sorry. All right, Melissa, have a good week. Run good at the tables.
All right.
And I will see you in 1 week's time for the next episode.
Okay.
Bye, guys.
Bye.